Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Habarigani. This is Sister Thage welcoming you to the liberated zone of Freedom Now, a Pan-Africanist and internationalist world affairs program with a jazzy music mix. Our jam-packed program agenda for this Saturday, September 21st, 2024. We commence with our sister Luyanda Kaboka and the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. Then, we bring you 3 full interviews this hour by none other than prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne, who interviews Dr. George Lipsitz, Professor Emeritus in the Black Studies Department at UC Santa Barbara and author of the book, The Danger Zone is Everywhere, How Housing Discrimination Harms Health and Steals Wealth. Then, Dr. Horne interviews Paul M. Presley, Director of the Osaba Island Education Alliance and author of the book, A Southern Underground Railroad, Black Georgians and the Promise of Spanish Florida and Indian Country. And we close out our Freedom Now hour with Dr. Horne interviewing Dr. Bronwen Everill, who teaches writing at Princeton University and author of the book, Not Made by Slaves, Ethical Capitalism in the Age of Abolition. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, Gene Ammons, John Coltrane, George Benson, and more. So sit back, phone a friend, and as always we stand ready for revolution.
Hotep. This is Sister Luyanda Kaboka with Freedom Now's weekly African Drumbeat historical calendar for the week of September 19th. This calendar is presented to provide historical continuity to the ongoing struggle of the oppressed so that we may take heart from the bygone struggles of our ancestors. September 20th, 1918. Mary Wang Choi was born. She was a leader of the movement to bring the United States and the state of Hawaii to trial for crimes committed against the indigenous people of Hawaii. She was a militant supporter of independence for the Hawaiian nation, which include complete control over their land and resources. September 21st, 1926. Reyes Lopez Tijerina, a one-time minister and traveling revivalist, was born. Tijerina and his federal land-grant alliance were the vanguard of the effort to reclaim stolen Mexican land, and in the process seized and occupied a courthouse and consistently challenged the United States national authorities. His autobiography, They Call Me King Tiger, is considered the Bible for the militant aspect of the Chicano movement. September 22nd, 1964. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, known as the Rebel Girl, was a socialist union organizer, Irish-American professional revolutionary, and founder of the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, who later ousted her for being a communist. She was a militant organizer, prolific essayist, and popular speaker who was the founding organizer of the Workers' Defense League and became the first woman to lead the Communist Party in the United States. September 22nd, 1960. Mali gains independence from French colonialism under the leadership of the revolutionary Pan-Africanist Modibo Keïta. Mali was the center of the first university in the world, Timbuktu. Mali, together with Ghana, Guinea, Egypt, Tanzania, and Algeria, formed the Casablanca bloc of anti-imperialist countries in Africa. September 22, 1941. George Jackson, leader of the Black Panther Party within the prison system, was born. Author of Soledad Brothers and Blood in My Eye, George was the charismatic leader of the revolutionary forces within the California prison system who tied racism with capitalism and the alternative of scientific socialism. Brother Jackson's analysis and activism sparked the spread of prison struggles throughout the country. His assassination by prison guards sparked off the Attica State Prison uprising, prompting the bloodiest suppression of inmates in U.S. history. September 23, 1904. Mariana Braceri, a revolutionary Puerto Rican independence fighter and leader of the September 23, 1868 Grito de Lares uprising, crosses over. She designed the first flag of independence. September 23, 1926. John Coltrane, considered the greatest jazz musician of all time, was born. John Coltrane was known for using the 3-on-1 chord approach and playing multiple notes at one time. In 1960, Coltrane formed his own quartet and created the most innovative and expressive music in jazz history, including the albums My Favorite Things, Africa Brass, Impressions, Giant Steps, and the greatest jazz album of all, A Love Supreme. Coltrane was the musical spiritual godhead of the Black Power movement. September 24, 1974. Guinea-Bissau gains independence after 350 years of Portuguese colonialism. The liberation of Guinea-Bissau under the leadership of socialist PAIGC, Party for the Independence of Guinea-Bissau of Cape Verde, was led by Amilcar Cabral. September 24, 1957. 9 African high school students under the threat of assassination integrate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, after centuries of denial of access to equal education. September 24, 1825. Frances E.W. Harper, aka Red Mulatto, because of her mixed Native American and African ancestry, was born. She was a prolific writer, an anti-slavery activist, and women's rights advocate. She popularized the use of Ebonics in her poetry and speeches. September 25, 1995. Annie Bessie Delaney crosses over. She was the second African woman in the U.S. to practice dentistry in New York, who more often than not dispensed free dental care to members of the African community. Her office became a central meeting place for activists and revolutionaries. September 25, 1964. Mozambique gains independence after 350 years of struggle against Portuguese colonialism, sustained by the United States and Western Europe colonial powers. This has been African Drumbeat Historical Calendar here at Freedom Now on KPFK 90.7 FM in Southern California and 98.7 FM in Central California, and live on the web at kpfk.org. Please join us in the chant of liberation, Amandla Awetu, which means the power is ours. Amandla Awetu, Amandla Awetu, Amandla Awetu.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is George Lipsitz, Research Professor Emeritus of Black Studies and Sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and author of the book, The Danger Zone is Everywhere: How Housing Discrimination Harms Health and Steals Wealth. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, George Lipsitz.
It's my pleasure to be here with you.
And it's our pleasure to have you. So why did you write this book?
Well, I've spent 30 years working with fair housing groups and 50 years working for educational equity. And it's gradually come to the fore for me, largely because of the profound wisdom of aggrieved communities in struggle, that housing discrimination harms health and steals wealth, that residential racial segregation is, of course, an economic and social injustice, but it's also a public health menace, that housing insecurity and poor health are key components in an unjust and destructive and deadly racial order. The most significant factor that relegates aggrieved communities to proximity to toxicity is residential segregation. And housing and health injuries affect education, employment, home value and tax appraisals, policing, mass incarceration, mortgage and insurance redlining, transportation. So in other words, it's one of these many forms of discrimination that impose arbitrary, irrational, and unnecessary obstacles to good health, good housing, asset accumulation, and dignified and decent social membership. And it doesn't just hurt the victims, it hurts everybody because it squanders resources and opportunities, talents that the society badly needs.
So how does racism impact home appraisals and tax assessments and even sales? I recall a recent story widely covered of a Black professor at Johns Hopkins University, and he is not singular in this regard, but in order to get a fair price for selling his home, he had to remove pictures of his family. He had to take down pictures of Black people, etc. So in that context, how do you respond to the question of racism impacting home appraisals and tax assessments?
Yeah, most of us think of a home appraisal as a neutral thing that somebody who's credentialed as an appraiser does, and that it accurately identifies the true value of a home. But as you said, in the case with Professor Connolly, and I have 5 other cases in chapter 4 of my book that fair housing councils around the country have discovered, when you have a white appraiser coming to look at a home that has a Black or a mixed race couple in it, they pay a terrible price. There was a case in Marin County in California where a house that had a beautiful view and $500,000 worth of improvements was given a low appraisal by the appraiser. And the family did what Professor Connolly did. They took the books by Toni Morrison off the shelves, the paintings by Jacob Lawrence off the walls. They had a white friend come and pretend to be the owner. And the appraisal was $500,000 more than it had been when the appraiser thought the owners were white, were Black. And so it pays a lot to be white, that there's an advantage in terms of assets. We think of race as a matter of pigment rather than of property, of identity rather than opportunity. And yet in this and many other cases, the home appraisals are artificially low. And this doesn't only mean that you sell your house for a lower price. It means you can't get a refinance the loan. You're deprived of capital that you could get from that. But Professor Andrew Carl has a great book called The Black Tax, which says that these same homes that are undervalued, that get low value appraisals in home sales, are overvalued, overtaxed when it comes to property tax appraisal. So Black people pay more for housing because the state tells them that it's worth a lot and they owe more, and then the appraisers lowball them. So you have lowball home appraisals and artificially high property tax appraisals. And so they're doomed either way. You know, in Black Reconstruction in America, Dr. Du Bois said, everything Black people did was wrong. And this is the way white supremacy works. And in the case of home appraisals and property tax appraisals, it works to doubly penalize them.
By the way, we interviewed Andrew Carl a few weeks ago on his book, The Black Tax, and that can be found on the kpfk.org archive website. But that brings me to the next question, which is the racialized effects of policing, sentencing, parole. What role do these factors play?
Well, there is, of course, a horrible price to be paid by predatory racialized policing. And that not only includes the murders that we've heard so much about justifiably, and the constant harassment and surveillance through what is known as broken windows policing, but also the whole series of allocating fines and fees against Black citizens that pay the revenue for municipalities. In Ferguson, Professor Walter Johnson's work shows that the city of Ferguson got more by fining Black people for having saggy pants, playing boomboxes, jaywalking, allegedly making lane changes, than it did by taxing Emerson Electric, which is a Fortune 500 company. And so massive funds go into city coffers. It's a revenue generator by having these fines, fees, and debts. And these things aren't routinely distributed. In Ferguson, the reason why it was racialized is that Section 8 housing concentrates a group of people in one part of the town, and that's the part of town that the police feel free to make stops and arrests, and that's the place where the judges charge excessive fines. Judges themselves who owed unpaid taxes and were never sent to jail for it. And so the policing, racialized policing, is made possible because people of different races are relegated to different places, that Black people and other aggrieved communities of color live in what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls sacrifice zones, abandoned areas, what Tricia Rose called places in proximity to toxicity. And that toxicity is not only health hazards like incinerators and toxic waste dumps, but it's also a social way in which those areas of town are treated differently. They have enormous amounts of transients. They have vacant lots, abandoned housing because of foreclosures that can then be used for criminal purposes. And they're both over-policed and underprotected. And the final thing is that predatory policing is itself a health hazard, that researchers have found that experience with the police is incredibly damaging to young people, especially because it doesn't allow them to feel secure in place, and it is related to things like hypertension and other illnesses of the nervous system.
So what is an algorithm, and what role does it play in your pages?
Yeah, well, somebody ought to write a book called Algorithm and Blues, because the algorithm is one of those things that appears to be a neutral device that produces very unneutral ends. It enables racist practices without having to admit racist intent. An algorithm is a mathematical equation that tends to look at possibilities, propensities, and it's used to assess risk by insurance companies, by landlords when they're judging the worthiness of a tenant. The police use it as predictive policing, and therefore the educational system uses these algorithms. And what they do is they make the victims of past discrimination be seen as people likely to produce bad behavior in the future, and therefore they're penalized. They're given worse terms for loans. They're made to pay higher insurance rates. They're more likely to be diverted into carceral and punitive educational classes. But all of this takes the results of segregation and racial subordination and rewards the perpetrators and punishes people for the success of how they've been mistreated in the past.
So, given all that you've described thus far, I think it's fair to assume that there has been grassroots mobilization to reverse these trends. Can you talk to us about that?
Well, this, I think, has been my most important finding, and it's the thing I would most like people to think about, that basically the people who run companies and governments cannot fix the things they've been broken. They can't undo the damage they've done, and that change is not going to come from the top down, so it has to be built from the bottom up. But everywhere I go, I see active and engaged community struggles for health and housing justice. I see fair housing councils where people of all races work together to create legislation, litigation, education, agitation, organization, and mobilization for fair access to housing and to assets that can appreciate and value. There are public health collectives like the Environmental Health Coalition in San Diego that makes promotoras, mothers in the neighborhood, into health educators, but also activists against pollution and dangerous zoning in their neighborhoods. In East Oakland, there are community gardens, and there's a boxing club that trains young people who want to learn how to box, to grow food that the neighborhood needs, to learn how to cultivate, as well as to combat. But also they then use that food to combat the fact that the neighborhoods they live in are food deserts. This young people learn skills in the food industry. They give food to people who are hungry, and then they sell food and use that for scholarships to send people in the neighborhood to college. They're not waiting for somebody to come and save them. They're not looking for the knight on the white horse. They're not looking for the new technology, the next election, the new media star, the new meme that's going to save them. They're doing for themselves. And this is what, Malcolm X always used to say, the freedom is there for the taking, and if you don't take it, you don't deserve it. There are art-based community building enterprises, like Building Healthy Communities in Boyle Heights. There's a young people's nurturing network about health and housing called Freedom Foundations in New Orleans, created by three men who were unfairly and unjustly incarcerated in the Angola State Penitentiary. And finally, there are community land trusts around the country, which are cooperatives that take speculation out of the housing market. And if they're done in the right way, they can provide affordable, accessible housing for people who are otherwise cut out. Now, of course, all of these can be co-opted, all of them can be diverted, some of them will fail. But it's important to recognize that even though we're at a time of terrible, vicious, vile, and violent racism, that masses are mobilized, masses are in motion, struggling to build an active and engaged constituency for racial justice.
Now, you mentioned in passing litigation. Can you talk to us more about the role lawyers have played in this movement?
Yeah, well, a bar owner in North St. Louis, when he talked about why he had to pay kickbacks to the police because it was a black bar in which gays and lesbians congregated, he said, George, the law is not the law. And so the law that's written down isn't necessarily the law that's implemented. 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 1968 Fair Housing Act, and for that matter, the 1866 Civil Rights Act guarantee a lot of the rights that we are still fighting for. But it's one thing to have them guaranteed on paper, and it's another thing to have them implemented, and that often requires litigation by cause-oriented lawyers. Now, we know in many ways the game is stacked. The whole critical race theory in law, developed by Kimberly Crenshaw and Cheryl Harris, Luke Harris, and others, tells us that the way precedent works in law is that there is an inbuilt advantage in which whiteness is treated as property, in which you have to justify anything that upsets the current property relations. But on the other hand, again, decades of activism and litigation has changed things. When the Fair Housing Act was passed, it was a toothless tiger. You basically had all the burden of proof was on the complainant. Even if there were individual acts, you had to prove a pattern of misconduct. And then if somehow you won without subpoena power, they capped the damages you could get at $1,000, which was less than the cost of litigation. But through 45, 50 years, 60 years of activism in the courts, the Fair Housing Act has been a valuable tool. It's not the only tool, and it's not a perfect tool, and the courts increasingly try to rein it in, but it's been a valuable tool that's increased the amount of damages that can be given for housing injuries, that increases the groups that can be considered protected by it. And it's even used in things like landlords raping Section 8 tenants and otherwise sexually abusing them when local prosecutors won't prosecute, but federal prosecutors have been able to prosecute using the fair housing law, saying that these practices are not just injuries to individuals, they're ways to intimidate all women from having freedom in the market to get decent housing. In Modesto, California, and Moore County in North Carolina, the Fair Housing Act has been useful in addressing environmental racism. In Evansville, Indiana, in Muskegon County, Indiana, there was a zoning that deprived Black community of pure water. And through the Fair Housing Act, they were able to get a decent water supply. So the law is what you make it. It's not a text, it's a practice. And if people use it, it's one of the tools that can be used. But it has to be accompanied by a mass constituency for justice.
Now, speaking of one of your latter points, could you expand upon gendered elements in your study?
Yeah. The gender thing is very important. And I want to correct myself here. I said Evansville, Indiana. It's Zanesville, Ohio, where that case was. So the gender situation is tremendously important. That, of course, nobody lives only as a raced person. That people have genders, they have sexualities, they have citizenship status. And particularly, I have a chapter in which I talk about the ways in which mass incarceration imposes special penalties on women, mainly women who are Black and Latinx, but also Asian American and Native American, that basically women are asked to do the most and they get the least. They have domestic centrality, but economic marginality. And so many of the holders of Section 8 vouchers are women. Many of the people unable to get loans on favorable terms are women. They are exploited as women and as people of color. And in the criminal justice system, they're often picked up because they don't have lawyers. They can't defend themselves. They live in areas where the only opportunities for work are in semi-illicit activities. When their partners are engaged in the drug trade, they're easy to prosecute, but they have nothing to trade. They're not central enough to the drug trade, and so they get maximum sentencing. And even if they were just marginally involved, the laws for maximum sentencing give them a kind of vengeful equity in that, being treated unequally everywhere else, they have to be sentenced with as much punitive punishment as if they were major drug dealers. And so, part of the issue is that we have to recognize that an injury to Black people or a gain by Black people isn't necessarily a gain by Black women. A gain by Black women isn't necessarily a gain by Black women who are queer or trans. Gains by Black women who are queer or trans aren't necessarily gains for women who are diagnosed with disabilities or don't have citizenship status or have a different language. And so we have to look at what Kimberly Crenshaw calls these intersectional injuries and devise intersectional remedies for them.
Now, Professor George Lipsitz, Research Professor Emeritus of Black Studies and Sociology at UC Santa Barbara, also the book, The Danger Zone is Everywhere. What's next on your research agenda?
Well, I think all of us ought to be looking for people who are looking for us. The great Ella Baker used to say, find somebody who's doing something and help them. So I've been trying to work with fair housing groups, with arts-based community health collectives, and trying to see what they need. There was a book put out by the participants in building healthy communities in Boyle Heights called Saludarte, using traditional arts for building health equity. And I think that I'm going to continue to work with them, to work with Asian immigrant women advocates in Oakland, the Freedom Foundations in New Orleans, and to see how I can be useful. There are things that I'm going to write and publish and as articles and books, and I hope people read them. But often the most valuable things we do are listening rather than speaking. My friend Rob Walser says that academics like us are always looking for a microphone when what we really need is a hearing aid. So I think the challenge is to try to see what is it that aggrieved people in struggle need and how can we help provide it for them.
Well, Professor Lipsitz, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Always an honor to talk to you. Thanks very much.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is her sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24, South Africa, and Press TV Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Paul Presley, director of the Ossabaw Island Education Alliance and author of the book, A Southern Underground Railroad, Black Georgians and the Promise of Spanish Florida and Indian Country. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Paul Presley.
Yes, I'm delighted to be here, first of all. It's a great honor. But, what brought me to this subject was I organized a symposium on the subject of African-American life in the Georgia Low Country, because very little had been written, and invited 9 distinguished historians, Pulitzer Prize winners, Bancroft Prize winners. 2008 became a book in 2010 by that same name. But I was so impressed with what they did, and I began to look around what I was doing on Ossabaw Island, and out popped a story that was a part of my first book on the rim of the Caribbean, colonial Georgia and the British Atlantic world. But out popped the story of Titus, and that was an enslaved person on Ossabaw, born and grew up there. And he, during the course of his 12-year career, he led 28 people to Spanish Florida. He crossed the border multiple times. He set up 3 different maroon communities, 1 in Florida and 2 in Georgia. He defied white authority at every turn. And I wanted to explore him. And eventually that became an article in the Journal of Southern History, but it also became the focus of this book. And it really was trying to understand what was the appeal for enslaved people on the Georgia coast. Jane Landers of Vanderbilt has done a wonderful job with Black society in Spanish Florida, but no one had looked at what impelled these people on the Georgia coast to make the decision to leave and embrace a different culture, a different language, both with the Spanish and the Seminoles. So that's been my quest.
Mm-hmm. Now, just to clarify, Florida, now under the U.S. flag, from about 1565 to about 1819 or 1820, was generally under the Spanish flag, although we'll speak about an intermittent period when it was under the Union Jack, the British flag. So what was the role of Spanish Florida, and particularly Africans in Spanish Florida, in sparking revolts in Georgia and South Carolina, and more particularly Stonewall's Revolt in 1739 in South Carolina, perhaps the bloodiest revolt of the enslaved during the entire period of British rule in North America?
Absolutely. And of course, we know that Spanish Florida, basically St. Augustine, which is a military outpost to help protect the treasure fleets that were coming from what became Mexico to Spain. And then South Carolina, Charleston is founded in 1670. Immediately, the Carolinians beginning descended, wrecking the mission system along the Georgia coast and the Gulf Coast, and tried to trying to take over the deerskin trade. And the Spanish did not have a lot of people, military, to fight back. One of the prime examples, one of the prime tools, was to promise freedom, their policy of sanctuary. If an enslaved person from South Carolina made it to St. Augustine and went to see the governor and asked for free status, he was asked, or she was asked, will you convert to Catholicism? And at that point, it became a free person. And that was very effective. In the 1730s, war was on the horizon between Spain and England. and it spilled over into Georgia and South Carolina and Spanish Florida. Georgia had been created, as you point out in your book, The Counter-Revolution. Georgia was created as a buffer state against the Spanish intruding on the Carolina sort of paradise, at least for those in the elite.
Mm-hmm. And so, as I understand it, you had Black men in military uniforms under the Spanish flag crossing over into South Carolina and trying to instigate revolt of the enslaved in South Carolina. Is that a fair rendition?
Well, let me sort of hone that just a bit. Yes, more or less. Black sailors were in Savannah. Keep in mind that slavery was forbidden. And for the first 7 years, that was fairly much the case. Not in the 10 years after that, trusteeship Georgia. But those sailors were also sailing to St. Augustine and to Beaufort, South Carolina. And they were carriers of information. And when they heard about the creation of this free Black community, Fort Mose, in 1738, they decided among themselves, we want to be part of that. They sailed back under Captain Caleb Davis, was the name of their captain. He went to, took them back to Beaufort. They sailed back to Beaufort, and they basically hijacked 2 boats. I think a total of 19 people went there, and those joined the group at Fort Mose. And I think you know this. There was a Oglethorpe leads an army. It's basically defeated, retreats, and then the Spanish government 2 years later leads a group in which they were in Spanish uniforms, Africans, African Americans, and attempt to get into Georgia and South Carolina. They are defeated at Bloody Marsh on St. Simon's Island.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about 1776? Intermittently, Florida had been transferred to British rule during roughly that period. And yet, Florida did not become the 14th colony to join the 13 colonies and seceding from the British Empire and setting up the United States of America, the country from which we're now speaking. So what role, if any, did Black people in St. Augustine, Florida, play in derailing the possibility of Florida becoming the 14th colony to join the 13 colonies in abandoning the British Empire?
That so-called 14th colony or 13th colony of Florida did not leave in large part because the British Army was very much in control. But the British Army was very much, it needed manpower, and it was open to the use of Africans and African Americans in their armed forces. And to succeed in fighting the Patriot government in Georgia, it initiated guerrilla bandits or guerrilla bands go into Georgia, and those bands included Africans. They were quite important. They included Seminoles. They included Creeks. But British loyalists sort of led these groups, and they went as far as South Carolina.
Now, you also in your book, Paul Presley, talk about the so-called Seminole Wars. These wars, circa 1818, circa 1830, circa 1850s, were some of the bloodiest conflicts the United States government was involved in before the war in Vietnam in the 20th century. They featured on the so-called Seminole side a Black Indigenous Alliance. Talk to us about that Black Indigenous Alliance.
My book stops in 1818 at the First Seminole War, but the question you ask is pertinent because it really focuses on the Patriot War of 1812, when President Madison was really trying to find ways to annex East Florida and encourage American settlers in Spanish Florida to revolt, along with young people, young men in Camden County, which is right there on the Georgia border with Florida, along with the Georgia State Militia. And they besieged St. Augustine. and a unit of the militia were trying to obtain supplies. And at that point, they were ambushed. And the remarkable thing is the ambush was orchestrated by two black armed units. One came from St. Augustine, the Free Black Militia. And these were hard fighters because they knew if they were captured, they knew what would happen to them. They would go back to slavery. They were not going to give up. And the second group, this is the first time it happens, are black Seminoles who came and joined with them. And they overwhelmed, and I said Georgian militia, it was actually a unit of the U.S. Marines. There were a group of 25 or 30 company that accompanied this, and they were unauthorized by Washington. And Captain Williams was killed as well as many of his men. The second event was the black Seminoles, the Seminole town that in revenge, the Georgia militia went towards the Alachua Seminoles, about 60 miles from St. Augustine. In the process, that group was ambushed. And for 7 days, they held on. They managed to extract themselves after losing a number of men. But when the final report was written, Colonel Newman said that the best fighters were the black Seminoles. They were the ones that fought like Americans. They were the ones that knew what would happen if they were captured.
So ultimately, there were other wars fought in the 1830s and the 1850s in particular. And finally, as I understand it, many of the Seminoles and their black allies were forced on the Trail of Tears, as it was called, to evacuate the southeast quadrant of North America and move to what was termed Indian country, today's Oklahoma. I take it that you're not dealing with that in your book, but do you have anything to add to that narrative?
I'm not dealing with it in my book, but yes, I could add something. I mean, one of the great unfortunate things is the fact that the black Seminoles would like to, in Oklahoma, who very much have their identity, been always a part of the Seminoles, have always fought with them, spoke the same language, have not been admitted fully into the Seminole group so that they can claim federal benefits. And I think that's a little bit of not a little bit, it is a great scandal.
Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Paul Presley, director of the Ossabaw Island Educational Alliance, author of the book, A Southern Underground Railroad, Black Georgians and the Promise of Spanish Florida and Indian Country. Once again, thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles.
Thank you.
We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Bronwen Everill, who teaches in the writing program at Princeton University in New Jersey, and is author of the book, Not Made by Slaves, Ethical Capitalism in the Age of Abolition. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Everill.
Thanks so much for having me.
So why did you write this book?
So I wrote an earlier book called Abolition and Empire in Sierra Leone and Liberia. And in that book, I was exploring the sort of links between the Abolition Project with its universalist values and its Enlightenment values, and the project of imperialism that sort of takes over in the 19th century. And I was curious about how those two overlapped. And looking at the projects in Sierra Leone and Liberia, which were both set up originally by the US and the UK as settlements for formerly enslaved people and for people who were freed from the slave trade in the Atlantic world. I was curious about how those projects overlapped with and sort of pushed back against British and American imperial ideologies in the 19th century. But while I was researching that book, I kept coming across this one business run by somebody called Zachary Macaulay. So the business is called Macaulay and Babington, and they were really interested in setting up a trading firm running out of Sierra Leone. Zachary Macaulay is the governor of Sierra Leone for a little while at the end of the 18th century. And when he gets back to Britain, he is really very keen to use his connections to that colony and use his connections to important abolitionists back in Britain to try to get a sort of profitable trade going. And he's part of this broader movement, which is what I was investigating with this book, that are interested in using the ideas that are emerging at the end of the 18th century about consumer-led capitalism to try to undermine the slave trade, to try to turn capitalism into something that can regulate the market rather than something which is unregulated as it had been across the 18th century. So I began by looking at his firm specifically, and then I was sort of tracing the links of the whole global supply chain that he's involved in, starting in West Africa, where he's mostly interested, and thinking about the products that they're trying to sell, the people that they're trying to sell to, and how they make their case that there's a way of doing capitalism ethically. And while I was researching that, I spent some time at the Huntington Library in California, and I came across there a note that Macaulay had written where he complains to the people that he's trading with back in Britain that, in fact, the slave traders who are still trading along the West African coast have started to counterfeit the brand of his of the ethical quote unquote company that he's working for, because the people that he's selling to in Sierra Leone, the Sierra Leoneans themselves, are willing to pay more for that. And I thought that was really fascinating, that actually this ethical capitalism thing was actually happening within West Africa too. This was not just something that people in Britain and in the US and also a little bit in France were sort of hooking onto, but actually was something that was being driven by African consumers themselves. So I thought that actually this needed to be a really transatlantic story. And so I expanded the story away from Macaulay and Babington as the sort of sole interest into this broader, how is everybody thinking about the ethics of capitalism in this period as they're moving away from the slave trade? And what are the ramifications? Because by the time of the Civil War, it's pretty clear that the impact of ethical consumerism has not actually manifested a new and virtuous version of capitalism, but actually has sort of created other kinds of problems. So by the end of the book, it becomes clear that in the US, some of the issues that arise are a sort of focus more internally on supporting any kind of free labor, which mostly tends to be at the time of the antebellum period, mostly tends to be white farmers. So there's a real sort of push towards that direction. And in the British Empire version, that there's this sort of emerging idea of a rising tide lifting all boats, right? So, okay, we'll shift away from slave labor and we'll shift towards other forms of quote unquote free labor that are really great for the consumer because actually we don't pay the workers enough in those other places. And so these are the sort of ideas that then affect the latter half of the 19th century and the sort of capitalism that we see emerging in that latter half of the 19th century.
So an analogy has been drawn between today's campaigns around so-called free trade coffee and what you are writing about in your book, Not Made by Slaves. Do you see the parallel? And of course, explain in your response the fair trade coffee campaign.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of overlap with fair trade coffee and also with sort of a lot of green and other ethical consumer movements. People who are trying to make the case that the global economy as it is now does not have to be disrupted necessarily for us to be able to solve global problems of poverty, of climate change, but actually can be useful for solving those problems, right? So this is the idea that capitalism can solve the problems that it creates itself. And that's very similar to what's going on in this period of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. In both cases, I think the hope is that, when consumers spend their money, which they, will inevitably do, they should think of that money that they're spending as a vote for behavior of a company, right? So that the idea is that if they're voting with their dollars for a green company rather than a sort of polluting company, or if they're voting with their dollars, if they're going to buy coffee anyway, if they're voting with their dollars for a fair trade coffee company, that will have a better effect on the global economy as a whole. Undoubtedly, that has aspects of truth, right? Like this isn't. I'm not a total downer on any of these campaigns. There are aspects of that are true. There are, really effective fair trade cooperatives, and there are people working in fair trade coffee production in places like Ethiopia who are using the proceeds from that in cooperatives to build schools and invest in their communities. The sort of problem overall is that if you're trying to fix the problem of capitalism, using capitalism to fix capitalism doesn't always work. If you're trying to use capitalism to fix a very specific problem, then that might work. But I think that the sort of results of the experiments that are undertaken in my book, Not Made by Slaves, show that, of course, if you're sort of using capitalism to save capitalism, that you create knock-on effects that then have to be fixed again later on down the line. So if the thing that you're trying to resolve is the dilemma of capitalism, then you can't use it to solve that problem.
So what role does Haiti, the independent Black republic, during the period that you're discussing, what role does Haiti play in your pages?
Yeah, so coffee plays a really important role, even then, because there were attempts by the abolitionists who were interested in using ethical capitalism to use brands to try to protect consumers from accidentally purchasing something that was produced by enslaved labor somewhere along the supply chain. So if you think about, a global supply chain now, things have made in China labels, or they have, made in America labels, so that people can differentiate. That wasn't all that different then. But that comes out of this movement, this idea that people should be able to recognize where their goods were produced so that they can think about that voting with the dollar effectively. And Haiti is a really excellent brand from that perspective, because everybody knows that Haiti overthrew slavery in their revolution at the beginning of at the end of the 18th century, and then when it established independence in the beginning of the 19th century. And Haiti produces coffee, and one of the sort of hallmarks of Haiti's coffee production was that it was able to be done by small producers. And so people in the ethical consumer movements were really keen to highlight the role of Haiti and to think about Haiti as an ethical brand and get that coffee to their consumers.
Mm-hmm. And what about Liberia, which has a U.S. connection insofar as it was initiated in no small measure by the American Colonization Society, which, among other things, wanted to get rid of the so-called free Negro population about 200 years ago, and created this settlement in West Africa that you've already alluded to. What role does Liberia play in your pages? Yeah, so
Liberia is a really interesting case, because there is a hope, in especially the 1850s, that Liberia will be able to produce some of these staple crops that are at that point being produced by enslaved labor for American consumers. So cotton is tried, sugar is tried, coffee is tried, and coffee actually really takes off. Unfortunately, not until the Civil War sort of gives it a kick, and then it has its moment in the 1870s and 1880s. But there's a sort of steady link of trade connections between Liberia and various anti-slavery organizations in particularly Philadelphia, but also elsewhere along in the Northeast, as people again turned to Liberia as a sort of recognizable brand of ethical consumption. They knew that the people who were going there were free, and so they were able to think about that label as being a genuine ethical label. Unfortunately, it sort of runs into that tension between whether people should be supporting people at home with their vote with $1 or whether they should be supporting people abroad. And in the US case, that creates this sort of tension. And then added on to that, there's the additional tension of people being concerned about, exactly as you said, the sort of racist undertones of the Liberian project from the perspective of the American Colonization Society, right? So if people are thinking about where to support with their dollar, do they support a local Black-owned business? Do they support any free business as long as it's in the U.S., or do they support a Liberian business? And what kind of meaning comes along with any of those purchases?
Mm-hmm. And what about Senegal and Senegambia? What role do they play in your pages?
Yeah, so I think Senegambia is a really interesting region because when I was looking into why it was that the ethical consumer movements were recognizable in a West African context as well, I sort of began researching the revolutions that were taking place in West Africa at the same time as the American Revolution and the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution, and saw that actually boycotting the slave trade was a really regular occurrence within those revolutions and within sort of smaller political movements in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And so Senegal has a connection to the Atlantic world in that there is both slave and non-slave trade going on with the French and the British throughout the 18th century. And when they have their revolution in the late 18th century, they sort of boycott the trade with the Atlantic world as a way of trying to regain control over the trade. So if you think about the sort of rampant globalization and consumerism of the 18th century as something that is is seen as completely unregulated and that is spinning out of control by the end of the 18th century. A lot of these movements are interested in regulating that globalization, regulating the expansion of capitalism, regulating consumerism. And they take it in different directions, but they all sort of turn to controlling trade and thinking about those trade links as a key moment.
Finally, Bronwen Everill, who teaches in the writing program at Princeton University in New Jersey, author of the book Not Made by Slaves, Ethical Capitalism in the Age of Abolition. What's next on your research agenda?
Yeah, so I have a book coming out globally in October, and in the US it will be out next year, called Africanomics, which looks at some of these kinds of questions about how people are intervening in the African continent, but up through today. So it's thinking about how people think about economics as a discipline, how people think about African economics specifically, and why continued re-interventions over 200 plus years always end up getting everything wrong, and sort of what role Africans can play in their sort of reclaiming that from Western institutions.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor Everill. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thanks very much for having me.
And in closing, we'd like to thank our guests. Thank you, Dr. George Lipsitz. Thank you, Mr. Paul Presley. Thank you, Dr. Bronwen Everill. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Sister Femi, Brother Brandon, our board op Wendell, and all those who made today's program possible. Signing off of Freedom Now, this is Sister Thage. Please stay tuned for our sister Sumta coming up next with Spotlight Africa. And as always, we stand ready for revolution.